Hi, I'm Jim Dickinson, Corporate Compliance Manager for Linden International. You know, a lot of freight forwarders like to Photoshop their names on airplanes, but Linden's got the real thing. Our sister company, Linden Air Cargo, has a fleet of Lockheed L-100 Hercules aircraft based in Alaska. But this is more than just a little self-promotion because, believe it or not, Linden's Hercs are ITAR-controlled. You see, the L-100 is essentially the same aircraft as the C-130, which is a favorite of the military. So, when it comes to export compliance, we feel your pain. In this session, we're going to talk about how the freight forwarder fits into the export controls picture. Census requires the filing of an export declaration for most shipments. There are exemptions for low values and goods going to Canada, unless a license is required or it is known to be going beyond Canada to some other country. In a nutshell, the freight forwarder files the export declaration with Census. Once accepted, Census responds with an internal transaction number, or ITN. The forwarder puts the ITN on the shipping documents, then gives the freight and documents to the carrier. The carrier then gives the documents to Customs for review. Customs uses the ITN to see what was filed with Census and compares that to the shipping documents. Occasionally, they may want to examine the cargo. If they have concerns that something has not been filed correctly in AES, or that another government agency's export requirements are not being met, they can detain the shipment and refer the matter to those other agencies. The export declaration used to be that yellow paper shipper's export declaration, or SED. I always hated these. We could put multiple Schedule B numbers in, but there was only one line for the licensing information. Does this license go with the first Schedule B, or the second Schedule B? Census fixed this problem with electronic filing. So, no more paper SEDs. Now we file the Electronic Export Information, or EEI, in the Automated Export System, or AES. Each Schedule B line has its own input screen with its own unique fields for licensing information. If you're an exporting company that files your own EEI, then you're probably familiar with this, and you probably know that you can print out your results that look like this. Right here is your licensing information, and up here is your ITN that you provide to the freight forwarder. Now, if you file your own EEI, make sure that your freight forwarder doesn't also file an EEI, because if that happens, you'll max out your license values and quantities a lot sooner than you think. For you exporting companies that have your freight forwarder file the EEI, you are entitled to this information, and you should request it from your freight forwarder. This is a printout that comes from AES. Your freight forwarder may have their own software that prints something a little different, but it should contain this basic information. By the way, since there's no more paper SED, there's no need for that old carbon-set shipper's letter of instruction to mirror the SED. So at Linden, I created a new SLI that has the licensing information on each Schedule B line. But whose job is it to determine this information? A lot of exporters don't know what their licensing information is. Some exporters don't even know what their Schedule B numbers are. So just who is responsible for this information anyway? According to Census Regulations 15 CFR 30.3c, the U.S. principal party in interest, that's the exporter, is responsible for providing the authorized agent, that's the freight forwarder, with accurate and timely export information necessary to file the EEI. That includes, but is not limited to, the commodity description, Schedule B, ECCN, destination country, intermediate, and ultimate consignees. And if you look at the Export Administration Regulations of the BIS, over at 15 CFR 758.3a, it says that the exporter must determine the licensing authority and obtain the appropriate license or other authorization. So, it's the exporting company's responsibility to figure out this information and provide it to the freight forwarder. There's a good reason for this. Freight forwarders are not engineers and scientists. They don't know your product like you do. Unfortunately, when freight forwarders push exporters for the missing information, some exporters will just go to another freight forwarder that, doesn't ask them any questions. But do you really want that? When you are legally accountable, do you really want a freight forwarder who knows little about your products and transactions to be making these determinations? And what about routed exports, ex-works shipments, where your foreign customer, takes care of everything? Are you off the hook? In a routed export, according to census regulations 15 CFR 30.3e, the USPPI is still responsible for a bunch of stuff that goes into the export declaration, including their identity, commodity description, Schedule B, ECCN, and get these last two, all licensing information necessary to file the EEI for commodities where the Department of State, Department of Commerce, or other agency issues a license, or the merchandise is being exported under a license exemption or license exception, and any information that it knows will affect the determination of license authorization. So, in a routed export, the USPPI is still responsible for what the item is. Presumably, you are not responsible for the destination country, end user, and end use. But if not, who is? Hold that thought. If you look at the BIS Export Administration Regulations, 15 CFR 758.3b, it says that the U.S. principal party in interest is the exporter and must determine the licensing authority and obtain appropriate license or other authorization unless the U.S. principal party in interest obtains from the foreign principal party in interest a writing where the foreign principal party in interest expressly assumes responsibility for determining licensing requirements and obtaining the license authority. For you exporting companies in the room, do you get that writing from your customer where they assume responsibility for licensing? Savvy exporters do. And if you don't, there can be some legal question as to whether this actually is a routed export, in which case you still might be on the hook for the destination country, end user, and end use, even though you don't control the freight forwarder or where he's sending it. Is that a risk you're willing to take? And what if it's ITAR controlled? I don't think the ITAR has provisions for routed exports, which probably means you're never off the hook for anything. And for you freight forwarders in the room, in a routed export, because you are the U.S. agent for the foreign principal party in interest, you are the exporter according to Export Administration regulations, and you are responsible for the destination country, end user, and end use. Since these are part of the license determination process, do you determine if a license is required? Do you know how? Do you understand the technical parameters of the product and the technology for a company that's not your normal customer? Are you screening for restricted parties? Are you checking for restricted end uses? Savvy freight forwarders do these things. And if a license is required, do you obtain that license, presumably in your name? Do you undertake all the documentation and reporting requirements that go with a license or a license exception? Savvy freight forwarders don't do these things. Instead, if there's a license or a license exception involved, they either get the USPPI's blessing to ship as not routed or simply won't handle it. Before we leave export declarations and AES, we should talk about the time frames for filing. For Commerce Department controlled items, whether under a license or not, it's 2 hours before departure for air, 24 hours for ocean. If you're shipping ITAR-controlled goods, then some modes of transport have longer lead times. Keep in mind, however, that these are the required times when the AES must be filed. Your freight forwarder may have some additional work to do ahead of filing, so they may want longer lead times. When you have a Commerce Department license, you just give the number to your freight forwarder, and the forwarder includes it with the export declaration. But a State Department license requires a few extra steps. For one, you have to lodge the license with Customs. According to the ITAR 22 CFR 123.22a1, for any permanent export of hardware using a license or an exemption in this subchapter, the exporter must, prior to AES filing, deposit the license and provide the required documentation for the license or the exemption with U.S. Customs and Border Protection, unless otherwise directed. Maybe some of you remember the old blue license. You'd receive the original from state that would have to be lodged with Customs. Typically, the freight forwarder would do this for you, but there was always confusion. Sometimes the exporter would keep the original, giving only a copy to the forwarder, leaving the forwarder to believe the original had already been lodged. Sometimes the original would get lost. Then what would you do? Thankfully, we don't have these anymore. Today, you get an electronic PDF of the license, but there's still confusion about the lodging of the license. In theory, when they are issued, the State Department could lodge them electronically with Customs, but it doesn't work that way. Hey, we're still years away from a single export control list. Instead, State will email you a digitally signed PDF. There's no original at this point. You should email the PDF to your freight forwarder, and your forwarder will then lodge it with Customs. Always coordinate with your freight forwarder on this and make sure everyone knows who's doing what, or if the license is already lodged from a previous shipment. Have your forwarder print 2 copies of the license and take both over to Customs. Customs will mark one original and keep it in their files. Your forwarder should get a second one marked as received by Customs. They usually perforate documents with a receipt date. Then the forwarder should keep that one in their files or send it to you. The main purpose for lodging the license with Customs is for them to decrement the license with each export. There's a decrementation table on the last page that looks like this. On a DSP-5 or other permanent export, decrementation occurs automatically when the EEI is filed with AES. Say you have a license to export 100 units of something for a total value of $100,000. If you ship out 100 or $100,000 worth, you will have exhausted the license, used it up. Now you need to get another license. Or suppose you ship out just 60 units. Then next month you can ship 40 more before you exhaust the license. Suppose the license was a DSP-73 for temporary exports. These are handled the old-fashioned way, by hand. The license must be presented to Customs and the decrementation, and later incrementation when the goods come back, is recorded by hand. In October, you export 100 units decrementing the license. Then in November, you re-import them, incrementing the license. Then you could export 100 units again, but you have to work with your customs broker on that import. If you fail to increment the license on that import, you'll have a problem when you later try to export again, because you would be exceeding the amount of your license. Similarly, if this were a DSP-61 temporary import license, and you bring in 100 units in October, be sure that you properly export them before the license expires, or someone's going to come around asking questions. Incidentally, for temporary import and export licenses, Customs will not retain the original. That's because decrementation is still done by hand, and you might re-import or re-export the goods at a different port, and you would have to send the license there. So, like I said earlier, you should always ask your forwarder to provide you with the AES record so you can check to see that the license is correctly reported. And since decrementation tables are still being used on the DSP-61s and DSP-73s, you should ask your freight forwarder to fax the decrementation page to you after each shipment. I've heard that both the state and the Commerce Departments have issued licenses for which no exports are ever reported. I wonder how much of this is because the licenses were omitted from the export declarations. That would be a violation, so it would be wise to take an active role in monitoring your freight forwarder's activities. You probably already know that you need to include your freight forwarder on the license application because they have to be shown on the license. Now, if your freight forwarder has their own offices at destination, this should be good enough. But if your forwarder doesn't have their own offices, but instead contracts with an unrelated freight forwarder, that freight forwarder should also be shown on the license. Your local forwarder should be able to tell you who that is. And if you have to change forwarders, you need to get an amendment to the license to add them. If you are not sure at the time of applying for the license, you can always include multiple forwarders on your application. One more thing. When shipping something under a license, you need to think about the routing via intermediate countries. Suppose you are shipping military goods to Switzerland. You got your State Department license from the U.S., and your customer got his import permits from the Swiss government. Your freight forwarder gets you a great air freight rate on a carrier changing planes in Frankfurt. Generally, a license will allow for transiting intermediate countries, so long as it is on a continuous bill of lading. But this is not always true. There can be some restrictions. So, understand your license requirements and always work with your freight forwarder and approve the routing before it actually ships. And be aware of the intermediate countries' regulations. Germany requires a license for military goods transiting Germany. The goods could be detained there and penalties issued. Thank you for your time, and here's my contact information at Linden. Some of you might also know me by my alias, Import Export Geeks, but you can contact me either way.